Well, hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the assistant comment editor at the Telegraph, Olivia Utley, and the columnist at the Guardian, Zoe Williams. Welcome to both of you. So, to the front pages then, let us start with the Financial Times. Sunak defends 10% pension rise as teachers threaten strikes over pay, reads the front of the FT. While tomorrow's Telegraph also focuses on the threatened teacher strikes, quoting Zahawi, who believes such a strike would be unforgivable. The rail strikes lead the Guardian, reading talks to end the rail dispute breakdown in acrimony. The Times also focusing on developments in the ongoing rail strikes with the headline, Unions pile pressure on bosses after a 7% pay deal. That's the deal between Mersey rail staff and the Transport Salaried Staffs Association. The Metro leads with the nationwide polio alert that traces of the incurable polio virus have been found in Britain's water system. Tomorrow's Eye also has that story on its cover with the headline, Polio found in Britain for the first time in 40 years. Very different story features on tomorrow's Daily Star. A psychotic seagull's holding me hostage is their headline. That is, I can't believe we're explaining this, a story about a seagull which attacks one poor fisherman every time he goes outside. Just him. Anyway, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's bring in our guests for the evening, Olivia and Zoe. Welcome to both of you. Zoe, why don't you kick off? It really is a case still of inflation hitting record levels, 9.1%. You know, the teachers now threatening strike action, which we'll come on to a minute. The rail strikes ongoing. Well, the Times picks up on one strike settlement, which the paper says piles pressure elsewhere with the pressure we're seeing.
So basically, there's in Liverpool, the drivers have got a deal of 7%, which commentators have called fanciful if other people on the rail network think they're going to have that match. Now, that is high by the standards of pay rises. The Docklands Light Railway the drivers got an 8% pay rise in similar circumstances. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that, as you just said, inflation is at 9%. So even 7% is an effective pay cut. 8% is an effective pay cut. So the idea that you know, Liverpudlian drivers have got this extraordinary deal, which could never be replicated elsewhere on the network, is itself quite fanciful. And there's a very peculiar dual narrative going on where we're asked to accept that these pay rises sound extraordinarily large at the same time as accepting that they still won't match inflation, and so they are still an effective pay cut. And I think that is probably the difficulty with all the talks breaking down. You know, the talks are being held, certainly from the network's point of view, along old school lines, that 7% sounds like a lot, 5% sounds like a lot. They were used to paying kind of 3% increases. But actually, in times like these, anything less than double digits is not a pay rise.
Well, to be fair, the national rail strike we've been talking about is not just about pay. It's about a lot of changes which are also unacceptable to the rail workers. But what about the spat we saw today between the RMT, who accused the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, of wrecking the negotiations, and he saying that was a plain lie? I mean, you know, the acrimony, the backdrop of this is also making the front pages of the newspapers as well. Olivia?
Yeah, the relationship between Grant Shapps and the unions is very bad. I think part of that is because he didn't meet them face to face. He didn't sort of try and nip the problem in the bud right at the beginning. You can see Nadeem Zahawi is already sort of making his stand against what a perceived potential teacher strike in the future. Grant Shapps didn't do that at all. So the background's very bad. It makes the government look a bit weak. And now, you know, of course, there's this deal in Merseyside, which makes other rail operators think that it'll be possible for them to get a similar sort of deal. As Zoe says, obviously, compared to inflation, it's not a huge deal. But the problem is, if you do enforce that across the whole of the rail network, then other workers across the whole of the public sector, understandably, as you can see it's happening already, are going to be demanding pay rises in line with inflation, and that will fuel more inflation. So that's the problem that the government's contending with. And some ministers, it seems, are doing a better job of it than others. I think Zahawi getting in there straight away does make a lot of sense. Shapps has been a little bit all over the place, and it feels a bit typical of Boris Johnson's cabinet, who quite often seem to be made up of just sort of who's been loyal to him over the last few months or whatever. They don't seem to be grasping the nettle.
So, well, let's move to education, shall we? The Daily Telegraph is leading with that. A teachers' strike would be unforgivable in the wake of COVID. This is the Education Secretary mentioned there, Zoe. And certainly we spoke to one of the unions today who suggested that already teachers had effectively lost between 17% and to 20% of their real terms salary, and that actually, you know, they do need to meet inflation. After all the hard work they've put in during the pandemics. I mean, I know you'll probably support that, but we're now talking about public sector pay, which costs the taxpayer money.
Well, look, I mean, there is certainly a problem with the backdrop here. The freeze of public sector salaries over the Cameron-Osborne era was really, really significant to teachers. I mean, I knew couples, one was a teacher and one was a doctor, who'd taken an effective pay cut because of the pay freeze of 40 grand over a period of 6 years. It's really significant what happened. And what it's done effectively is to turn a lot of people, some of whom would have been quite high up in their profession, probably quite small C conservative, certainly much more focused on their, work than on activism. And it's radicalised them by giving them a very unfair pay settlement over a number of years. So, I mean, I feel for the education minister because he's coming out with this kind of very classic rhetoric about what's unforgivable and what isn't. But a huge number of teachers will just look at this and think, exactly how much pay erosion do you expect us to take? Exactly how much of a decline in living standards do you expect us to take before we do something? And bear in mind, teachers are prepared to strike. They're actually their unions are quite ready to ballot them on strike action and to take strike action. So it's quite a gamble to think that we can shame them into not doing it. I would be really surprised if they didn't strike.
So how much wriggle room is there, do you think? How much willingness is there from government and the departments to allow some sort of correction because of austerity since 2010, Olivia? Is there a sense that actually it is due? And given that there are so many jobs vacancies, actually eventually you're going to have to start paying staff, aren't you?
I think there will be, the government will enter into conversations, definitely. But I think the government is keen to talk to teachers directly, and I think teachers are prepared to, they understand what children have gone through. Most of the teachers who I've spoken to aren't interested in striking at all because they've watched the children who they've taught and nurtured over years really, really struggle over the COVID pandemic and want them to be back at school learning. And a couple of teachers I've spoken to are quite worried about the actions of the teaching unions, which they see as just very politicalised and very radicalised and not particularly interested in the children that these teachers are teaching. So I think the government is a bit worried about engaging in conversations with unions. As we saw over the COVID pandemic, there were plenty of the particularly militant unions who didn't want teachers to go back to school when it was obviously completely safe, when every other industry was back in work. They didn't want teachers to be in the classroom. They kept finding reasons for teachers not to be back in the classroom. And it seemed to be just because they wanted to pick a fight with the government. So I think, radicalised unions isn't going to be what makes the government change its mind over these things. So I think, yes, there will be a little bit of wriggle room perhaps somewhere, but the unions are probably going to make the matter a lot worse.
And we saw the Financial Times there. Rishi Sunak forced to defend the fact that pensioners will get 10% effectively. The accusation that actually pensioners are more likely to vote Conservative, but benefits are also included in this figure.
But listen, even if you say pensioners are more likely to vote Conservative or less likely to vote Conservative, what this does is destroy the argument which Olivia very elegantly just made. If it's reasonable to give pensioners a 9% boost, a triple lock boost, then it's not reasonable to ask public sector workers to live through a decade of pay freeze and then take an effective pay cut. You can't have it both ways.
Well, most pensioners don't have any other income was the argument as well, isn't it?
No, that's not an argument, is it? Because the triple lock of the pension is to keep in line with inflation. So if pensioners need to keep in line with inflation, then so do wages. And teachers don't have any other wages. You know, train drivers don't have any other wages. All they've got is the wage that they've got. So it's effectively saying pensioners are affected by inflation, whereas working people aren't. Now, it's a preposterous position. And the idea that working people are radical for asking for an inflation-meeting pay rise, which isn't a pay rise, it's just your pay staying the same, is really, it's just illogical. And I think it's an illogical position which you might be able to maintain were it not for this triple lock situation in which Sunak is saying that it's necessary for pensioners but not necessary for working people.
So Olivia, what are the political benefits, Olivia, of the government holding the line on this and being so vociferously against the rail strikes? What are they hoping to achieve by all of that?
Well, I do think there is an element of the grey vote, and the Conservatives know, every party knows that older people are just more likely and willing to go out to vote. And so I think part of it is appealing to them. In the government's defence, and I think the triple lock is a bad idea, and I think it is completely illogical. And I agree with what Zoe just said, but from the other side, I don't think anyone should be getting a massive pay rise in times of, even though I know it wouldn't count as a massive pay rise, but in times when inflation is going like this, I think it will just make the economy worse and worse for everyone in the long run. So I don't agree with the triple lock, but I think, you know, the argument that Rishi Sunak would make is that, yes, one thing, pensioners don't have any other source of income. Also, actually, the state pension in this country is £9,500 a year. It's not huge. And there are pensioners. I think there are quite a lot of people, you know, myself among them, it's easy to imagine pensioners as rich people who we happen to know, who you know, in our London circles, the pensioners that we know aren't particularly badly off, but there are plenty of pensioners who are completely reliant on their state pension of £9,500. That's one of the lowest pension incomes in the developed world. So I can sort of see the need for raising the state pension, but I do think that saying that pensioners somehow need a pay rise in line with inflation and other workers don't is nonsense, which is why I think the triple lock is completely logical and isn't sustainable.
OK, we will see how this progresses. Obviously, more rail strikes to come. Both of you stay there. Lots more to discuss, including the news that polio found in Britain for the first time in 40 years. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Let us rejoin our guests this evening, Zoe Williams and Olivia Utley. Welcome back to both of you. The Eye and the Daily Mail both leading on the fact that polio has been found in Britain, Olivia. This is once again stressing the importance of getting your vaccine sorted too, isn't it?
Yeah, so polio has been found in sewage samples in North and East London. There aren't yet any cases of polio, but this is the first time that a sample of polio has been detected since, I think it was 1980 and 1984. That was the last transmissible round of polio. And then it was completely eradicated in the UK in 2003. So this is really alarming. And you know, it implies that there have been people who we know that children not getting their vaccines was on the rise. Part of that was because of lockdown. So there's going to be this renewed effort to get children vaccinated, starting in Hackney, where the sample was found, and the rest of East London. And you know, let's hope we can nip it in the bud this time, because it's clearly a really horrible disease with lifelong effects. So yeah, let's hope those vaccines get done.
Yes, the Eye is saying that family doctors have been put on alert with unexplained paralysis, because that's the problem, isn't it? In the worst cases, polio can paralyse or even kill. And doctors, the Mail tells us, most of whom will have no direct experience of the disease, are having to be given reminders of the symptoms to look out for, Zoe.
It's amazing. I mean, my aunt had polio as a child, and then the effects were devastating, actually. She does have lifelong paralysis down one side. But she's 91, I think. So that gives a sense of how long it is since we've had to confront something as serious. And this is something, you know, that comes up every single time there's any disease of any gravity, is that the worst possible outcome is that it affects children, and affects children permanently. So, yeah, I can imagine it's panic stations and a vaccine drive. And You know, the 2010s have a lot to answer for in terms of the anti-vax spirit, because it never had any basis in science, and it would be absolutely tragic if it had lifelong effects for people now.
Let's head to news of Rwanda. Not a plane or two this time, but it's time for CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, in which both the Prince of Wales and the Prime Minister are attending and meeting. And the question mark in the Telegraph, I suppose, hanging there is how awkward might it be, Olivia?
Yeah, because Boris Johnson says that this has sort of been his flagship policy over the last few months. And Prince Charles was rumoured to have said that it's appalling. And now they're meeting and discussing it for the first time. Sources are playing down the prospect of them talking about Rwanda, but it hasn't been ruled out completely. So this could be an awkward first proper, chat between Boris and Prince Charles, and a sort of harbinger of things to come, because one day Prince Charles will be king, and how he interacts with a prime minister like Boris Johnson now will be very interesting to see.
You've got 30 seconds on the inside pages of the Express, Zoe, which is the pioneers of the Windrush generation, picturing the Duchess of Cambridge there.
Well, this actually really picks up well from the last story, because, this speech by Prince William is basically a slap in the face to the hostile environment. I mean, you cannot, as the heir to the throne of England, stand up and say the Windrush generation has been peerlessly valuable to this nation without that meaning something. I mean, it means a lot. And I think a lot of the kind of empty rhetoric, and I always thought Rwanda was gestural, even though it was horrible for the people who they tried to deport. And I thought the go home or face arrest bans by Theresa May were also gestural. I think a lot of the hostile environment is just empty political gestures.
Zoe?
But the royal family is against it.
Apologies for cutting in there. We have run out of time. Zoe Williams, Olivia Utley, thank you both very much indeed.